Beneath the towering walls of Hampton Court Palace, a queen lay fading only 12 days after providing England with the long-desired male heir. As the bells tolled joyously to mark the birth of Edward VI, Jane Seymour was dying in anguish, her body succumbing to complications that Tudor-era medicine was powerless to heal. She had achieved what none of Henry VIII's previous wives could. She gave birth to the son who secured the future of the royal line. But instead of receiving care or gratitude, she was left to face death alone. While Henry celebrated the arrival of his heir, Jane was slipping away, abandoned in her final moment. Though history would label her as the wife who triumphed where others failed, the darker reality is clear. Once her role was fulfilled, she became disposable. Jane's fate exposes the ruthless logic at the heart of Tudor politics, where women's worth was calculated solely by their ability to produce male heirs. Even queens were cast aside once their reproductive function had been exhausted. By the year 1536, Henry VIII had become a monarch, driven by both fury and two queens had already suffered the consequences of his unrelenting demand for a legitimate son. Catherine of Aragon, his first consort, had been discarded and left to die in isolation after enduring years of disgrace. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had severed ties with the Catholic Church, was executed at the Tower of London after failing to bear a male child. The royal court had morphed into a deadly arena where influential families pushed their daughters forward as offerings to satisfy the king's dynastic obsession. It was into this tense and dangerous atmosphere that Jane Seymour emerged. A reserved lady-in-waiting with a seemingly plain appearance, Jane concealed a keen political instinct. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose intelligence and boldness often challenged the king, Jane crafted an image that embodied the era's ideals of female virtue: meek, devout, and grounded in tradition. Her family, the Seymours of Wiltshire, saw in Jane a rare chance to rise and they seized it with calculated ambition. Having watched Anne's meteoric ascent and catastrophic downfall, they knew that only a careful balance of ambition and caution would ensure survival. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, meticulously arranged her path to power. They installed her within Anne Boleyn's household, allowing her to study closely the missteps that had led to Anne's doom. Where Anne had openly challenged the king and proudly displayed her education, Jane portrayed herself as his polar opposite: humble instead of daring, conservative rather than reformist, silent where Anne had spoken too freely. This carefully constructed image proved devastatingly persuasive. Henry's pursuit of Jane began even before Anne Boleyn had been dethroned, a fact that highlights the king's predatory disposition. Under guidance, Jane initially resisted his advances, presenting herself as a chaste woman whose virtue outweighed royal temptation. This tactic only heightened the king's desire, while simultaneously casting Jane as morally superior to the queen. By May 1536, as Anne faced fabricated accusations of infidelity and treason, Jane was already being measured for her coronation gowns. That harrowing spring laid bare the cold strategy behind Henry VIII's matrimonial policies. Anne Boleyn met her end on May 19, 1536, beheaded by a French executioner summoned expressly for the occasion. Merely 11 days later, on May 30, Henry wed Jane Seymour in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. His mourning for Anne was fleeting less than a week soon, replaced by an insatiable drive to secure another vessel, capable of bearing him a male heir. Though Jane's wedding should have marked her ultimate triumph, Those in attendance noted her pallid complexion and trembling hand. She knew all too well she was stepping into a deadly pattern that had already devoured 2 queens. The ceremony was intentionally subdued, devoid of the grandeur that had defined Henry's earlier nuptials. But this simplicity was not born of modesty, it was rooted in fear. Henry had learned through bitter experience that the grandeur of royal unions often ended with the grim spectacle of state-sanctioned execution. Contemporaries described Jane's early queenship using loaded phrases: appropriately obedient, pleasingly discreet, and properly domestic. These were not praises, but coded assessments of her survival strategy. Jane had examined the tragic downfalls of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, and shaped herself into the ideal consort, whatever that required in the moment. Her public identity became a careful performance aimed solely at preserving her life long enough to produce the heir who would immortalize her. The royal court watched Jane's every gesture with morbid anticipation, speculating on her odds of surviving and whether she would succeed where others had perished. Reports from foreign envoys described a queen who kept to safe topics, avoided political entanglements, and focused on faith and charitable acts. Jane understood that queens who dared to express their minds often found their voices silenced permanently. When Jane's pregnancy was confirmed in early 1537, her status shifted instantly from individual to invaluable political instrument. The news reverberated across European capitals, where rulers and diplomats grasped the implications. England's break from Rome might gain divine endorsement if Jane delivered a healthy son. Failure, however, whether by miscarriage, stillbirth, or another daughter, would likely condemn her to the same fate as her forerunners. The king's response to the pregnancy exposed the intensity of his obsession. Eyewitnesses recounted his emotional swings between elation and dread, driven by a volatile mixture of hope and anxiety. Jane was placed under constant surveillance, encircled by a team of physicians and midwives whose very survival might depend on delivering a live, healthy boy. The queen effectively became a captive in her royal chambers, her body treated not as her own, but as the cradle of dynastic continuity. Her pregnancy proceeded under unprecedented control. Each dish was selected by court doctors, each activity scrutinized by the king's advisors, and every symptom interpreted as a potential omen. Envoys abroad received meticulous updates on her condition, aware that England's political trajectory might shift based on the outcome of her pregnancy. The Spanish ambassador noted that the king's mood shifted hour by hour depending on updates about the queen's condition, a reflection of just how much hinged on the gender of her child. Meanwhile, the rituals and beliefs surrounding royal pregnancies in the 1500s bordered on the archaic. Jane was barred from seeing individuals with physical deformities, out of fear that such exposure might imprint abnormalities on her unborn child. She was instructed to engage in relentless prayer and contemplation, as her spiritual well-being was deemed as vital as her physical state. Each day, royal astrologers charted the heavens, searching for auspicious signs while quietly preparing rationales for possible misfortunes. These customs reveal a court teetering on the edge of panic. As Jane's pregnancy progressed, Henry's behavior grew increasingly unstable. He spared no expense in organizing an extravagant christening for a son, even as he quietly commissioned arrangements for Jane's funeral. This simultaneous preparation illustrates the pragmatic heart of Tudor rule, where affection was subordinate to legacy. and mourning could be planned just as precisely as celebration. The king's chambers housed both swaddling gowns and burial linens, stark emblems of his conflicting hopes and fears. Hampton Court Palace was deliberately chosen as the place of birth. Its recent renovations had made it one of the most advanced medical venues in the kingdom, equipped with rooms designed specifically for royal deliveries. Yet the palace carried a sinister history. It was the place where Henry had honeymooned with Anne Boleyn and first contemplated her downfall. The very walls of the estate seemed to murmur forebodings about the grim fate awaiting queens who failed to meet the king's expectations. Jane's final weeks of pregnancy were steeped in growing solitude and dread. Eyewitnesses noted her increasingly pale demeanor, her quiet withdrawal from court life, and her dwindling appetite. The typical anticipation surrounding childbirth was eclipsed by the looming threat of death. Jane had witnessed the downfall of two queens before her. She understood that if she didn't survive the labor, her demise could conveniently pave the way for the king's next union. The physicians tasked with Jane's care were themselves under immense strain. Though their medical knowledge was rudimentary by modern standards, their political instincts were razor sharp. They understood all too well that should Jane perish, they might be held responsible. This grim awareness led to a tense atmosphere of forced competence, where treatments were often guided more by Henry's expectations than by any real scientific rationale. On the 9th of October, 1537, Jane Seymour entered labor at Hampton Court, a process that would span 3 grueling days and alter the course of English history. Her cries echoed through the palace corridors, where courtiers waited with bated breath, aware that the future of the realm was being forged in blood and anguish. Accounts from the time describe the delivery as exceptionally harrowing, her pain audible throughout the royal apartments. That birthing chamber became a crucible of superstition and medieval medical practice, where desperate prayers mingled with outdated remedies. Royal physicians, midwives, and court attendants clustered around Jane's bedside, while Henry roamed the adjoining chambers, oscillating between fervent prayers and fits of anger as news of her suffering reached him. The birth was complicated by what we now know as a breech presentation, an obstetric emergency. The Tudor doctors barely understood. Their main responses were devout supplication, rudimentary herbal treatments, and a relentless resolve to deliver a living child, regardless of the consequences for the mother. Clergymen were called in to administer spiritual aid, recognizing that Jane's soul held equal weight to her body in this divine contest for a male successor. Last rites were performed several times as Jane seemed close to death, only for her to regain consciousness and endure further waves of torment. Protestant allies, who supported Henry's separation from Rome, interpreted Jane's suffering as divine reckoning, while Catholic observers quietly claimed that God was avenging the king's marital transgressions. As the delivery entered its second day, grim rumors circulated throughout London that both queen and child were doomed. Foreign emissaries drafted encrypted dispatches, ready to report either a glorious announcement or a royal catastrophe. Across the city, churches filled with worshippers pleading for the Queen's life, though some privately hoped her death might rid the realm of Henry's increasingly tyrannical rule. Jane had come to symbolize the ultimate maternal sacrifice, her agony, a mirror of the countless women crushed under the weight of dynastic demands. Finally, on the 12th of October, after nearly 72 hours of excruciating labor, experienced midwives succeeded in delivering the child. The infant's first cries echoed through Hampton Court, followed by exclamations of joy. "It's a boy! A prince is born!" But amidst the celebration, grave concern mounted in the birthing room. Jane's body had suffered irreparable trauma, and uncontrollable bleeding signaled complications beyond what Tudor medicine could handle. The baby who would become Edward VI was swiftly taken for examination and announced to the court. His strong cries and healthy appearance brought immense relief to the palace. Yet Jane's condition worsened. The midwives, desperate to stem the hemorrhaging, resorted to methods more harmful than helpful scalding compresses, crude herbal treatments, and excessive bloodletting. These desperate, outdated remedies only hastened her decline. Henry's response to his son's arrival was reportedly one of ecstatic triumph, swiftly followed by indifference toward Jane's worsening state. Eyewitnesses suggest that once the prince's survival was confirmed, the king's concern for his wife vanished. His ambition had been realized: a male successor to secure the Tudor legacy. The queen who had borne this treasure was now little more than a spent vessel, her purpose fulfilled. In the hours that followed, the brutal hierarchy of Tudor priorities became starkly evident. As Jane lay in agony, her body unraveling, Henry was already engrossed in preparations for the newborn prince's baptismal rites. As arrangements for the christening ceremony advanced and political gains were assessed, the queen who had given Henry everything he desired was already fading into the background of his triumphant dynastic narrative. Her agony was eclipsed by the radiance of his success. Jane Seymour's last days began with a deceptive sign of Recovery-an illusion that made her eventual death all the more heart-wrenching. In the immediate days following Edward's birth, Jane appeared to improve. She sat up to cradle her newborn and received well-wishers who lauded her for fulfilling her regal duty. Eyewitnesses described her as frail but lucid, expressing joy at having granted England its long-awaited prince, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her body was succumbing to fatal complications beneath the surface. In 1537, medical comprehension of postpartum conditions was rudimentary at best. What we now recognize as puerperal sepsis, a deadly bacterial infection caused by poor hygiene during childbirth and internal trauma, was misdiagnosed by Tudor doctors as mere exhaustion that would resolve with time, rest, and prayer. Jane's escalating fever was countered with damp cloths and herbal tinctures, while her growing confusion was dismissed as fatigue rather than the onset of septicemia. By the 5th day, her condition had become critical. Jane began to experience intense abdominal pain and chills, sparking panic among her medical attendants. In desperation, they turned to increasingly archaic treatments: bloodletting to rebalance her humors, purgatives to cleanse supposed toxins, and rare imported remedies. Purchased at great expense from Europe, these interventions likely exacerbated her suffering, but the physicians pressed unaware that the Queen's death might lead to their own downfall. Henry's conduct during this crisis exposed the cold logic that defined his reign. While his wife drifted toward death, he immersed himself in orchestrating Edward's baptism, focusing more on political presentation than personal loss. When updated on Jane's worsening condition, he allegedly brushed off concerns, coldly remarking, "Queens have died in childbirth before," and adding, "It is the prince that matters." He had detached emotionally. Jane had done her duty, and her survival no longer fit within his dynastic objectives. According to her ladies-in-waiting, Jane's final conscious words were prayers for her son's well-being and pleas for Henry's pardon for any perceived shortcomings as a wife. Even in a haze of fever and pain, she clung to the obedient persona that had preserved her position for a year and a half. She apologized for Dianga's, though her death were a failure on her part, rather than the tragic outcome of outdated medical practices and her husband's unrelenting ambition. These final utterances capture the profound psychological toll inflicted on women by life in the Tudor court. Foreign envoys documented Jane's final hours with precision, sending comprehensive reports to their sovereigns, fully aware that the Queen's demise would carry major political consequences. The imperial ambassador noted that the king showed little visible sorrow, remaining entirely focused on the well-being of his newborn heir. The French representative remarked that Henry had already begun considering future matrimonial alliances, while Jane still lingered on her deathbed. A replacement was being planned before her burial had even been arranged. Members of the royal household who were present during Jane's decline described harrowing scenes of suffering, largely dismissed by the male elite of the court. As her ladies-in-waiting maintained a solemn watch at the Queen's bedside, male courtiers toasted the health of the infant prince in adjoining rooms. The contrast was stark, and symbolic female anguish remained unseen and unimportant beside the celebration of male lineage and royal legacy. Jane's cries of pain were smothered by the revelry for Edward's ascent. Clergy were summoned repeatedly to perform last rites, as Jane drifted between moments of clarity and delirium. Competing religious factions, Catholics and Protestants, vied for spiritual dominance, each insisting their intercessions would better secure Jane's soul. This spiritual struggle at her deathbed revealed how even her passing became entangled in broader doctrinal battles. Jane's salvation became another pawn in Henry's ongoing war against traditional Catholicism. In the early hours of the 24th of October, 1537, Jane Seymour died 12 days after giving birth to the son who cost her her life. Her end came not with the spectacle that marked Anne Boleyn's execution, but with the weary surrender of a body worn down by reproductive expectations. Eyewitnesses described her passing as calm, but beneath the stillness was the brutal internal breakdown that had steadily worsened since Edward's birth. She died attended only by her devoted ladies, while Henry slept in distant quarters, seemingly unmoved by her final struggle. The king's initial reaction to the news was reportedly one of indifference rather than heartbreak. Witnesses recalled that his first questions concerned whether the news might unsettle the infant prince and what arrangements needed to be made for Jane's burial, with emphasis on cost. Having weathered multiple failed marriages, Henry had trained himself to emotionally detach. Jane's death was treated not as a personal catastrophe, but as a bureaucratic inconvenience. Mere hours after her passing, Henry convened with his advisors to assess the political fallout of his newly widowed state. Their discussions did not dwell on mourning etiquette, but instead pivoted to the strategic timing of his next union and the diplomatic leverage it might offer. Jane's body had barely cooled when speculation began about which continental noblewoman would be summoned to fill the void she left behind. This swift shift from death to courtship underscores the transactional nature of matrimonial politics in the Tudor world. The royal court's official handling of Jane Seymour's death was meticulously orchestrated to absolve the king of any blame. Public statements celebrated her successful delivery of a male heir and cast her death as a noble act of sacrifice for England's destiny. There was no mention of the inadequate medical treatment, the unsanitary conditions, or Henry's emotional detachment during her final hours. The messaging was carefully designed to recast a preventable loss as a tale of patriotic martyrdom. Foreign emissaries couldn't help but observe the jarring contrast between the fanfare of Edward's birth and the quiet, almost indifferent acknowledgement of Jane's passing, whereas the prince's arrival was met with cannon blasts, feasts, and grand proclamations. His mother's death barely registered publicly. This stark disparity highlighted how little value was placed on preserving the lives of women once they had fulfilled their reproductive roles. In the eyes of the court, the vessel had served its purpose and could now be discarded. Members of Henry's personal retinue later revealed that he exhibited no outward signs of grief in the aftermath of Jane's death. He maintained his usual schedule of leisure and governance, showing no interruption to his routines. When approached with condolences, he reportedly deflected them and shifted the conversation toward Edward's care and future. His cold detachment raised doubts among those around him about whether Jane had ever held any real place in his affections or had merely been a convenient means to an end. The handling of Jane's belongings after her death further highlighted how quickly she was devalued. Her jewelry and courtly assets were swiftly inventoried for redistribution or sale, while her personal effects letters, tokens, and keepsakes were destroyed without scrutiny. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose fall inspired widespread record-keeping, Jane's quiet death was subjected to intentional erasure, as though recognizing her ordeal might threaten the carefully cultivated image of Tudor glory. Even by the ruthless standards of Henry's court, the speed at which Jane was forgotten was stunning. Courtiers who had once sought her favor quickly pivoted toward new alliances. Her closest attendants, the women who had stayed by her side in her final moments, were reassigned and silenced. Her death was treated less as a national loss and more as an inconvenient disruption to courtly operations. In the narrative that followed, Jane Seymour was reimagined not as a discarded queen, but as a sanctified figure. Her memory was repurposed to reinforce Henry's political narrative. The King's chroniclers quickly shaped a myth of the ideal Tudor consortable, loyal, and ultimately willing to give her life for England's future. This posthumous idealization concealed the harsh truths of her abandonment and reframed her suffering as virtuous, ensuring the monarchy's image remained untarnished while supporting patriarchal power. The official chroniclers of the court, operating under Henry's direct oversight, portrayed Jane as the epitome of dutiful royalty, gladly embracing her role and joyfully providing the long-awaited heir. Her death was framed as a selfless offering, suggesting she had willingly given her life to ensure England's future through Edward's birth. Absent from this narrative, however, were any references to Henry's emotional detachment, the primitive healthcare she endured, or the institutional negligence that actually led to her demise. Jane was reshaped into a sainted mother rather than acknowledged as a casualty of royal ruthlessness. In their bid to solidify power under the young king, Protestant reformers elevated Jane as the perfect Christian queen, whose death symbolized the triumph over Catholicism. They contrasted her supposed humility and piety with the perceived arrogance and sin of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, using this portrayal to retroactively justify Henry's controversial marital decisions. Her passing was framed as divine endorsement of the Reformation, positioning her son Edward as a divinely appointed leader of Protestant England. Art and literature from the years following Jane's death bore little resemblance to the anxious, cautious queen who had walked the halls of Henry's court. Artists painted her as composed and radiant, surrounded by emblems of motherhood and spiritual grace. These idealized images, often produced long after her death, erased the fear, trauma, and exhaustion witnessed by those who had attended her. The propaganda effort visually remade her from a political casualty into a flawless archetype of womanhood. Henry's own efforts to immortalize Jane were tinged with strategic revisionism. In his later life, he declared that Jane had been his only true wife, the one who loved him unconditionally and delivered his greatest legacy. This reimagining conveniently ignored his neglect during her final illness and the speed with which he resumed his marital pursuits after her passing. By elevating Jane above his other wives, Henry recast himself not as a tyrant, but as a grieving husband devoted to a singular virtuous queen. The tomb constructed for Jane at Windsor Castle became yet another instrument of historical distortion. Completed years after her death, the monument depicted her as a monarch who died in glory, with no mention of the medical failings or emotional abandonment that hastened her end. Her epitaph celebrated the birth of the heir while omitting the costs paid by the woman who bore him. Even in death, Jane's lived reality was overwritten to support Tudor authority. Reactions to Jane's sanctification varied across Europe, often reflecting diplomatic tensions. Courts in Spain and France, opposed to Henry's religious break from Rome, quietly doubted the official version of events, but stopped short of public dissent. Protestant German states, eager to strengthen ties with England, fully embraced the myth of Jane's sacrificial virtue. Her death became yet another data point in the broader ideological struggle sweeping across Europe. Personal suffering subsumed within geopolitical narratives. Perhaps the most painful irony in Jane's posthumous glorification was the way it erased the very conditions that led to her death. By framing her demise as noble destiny rather than a preventable failure, the Tudor regime effectively masked the systemic dangers still facing women at court. By framing Jane's death as a noble martyrdom instead of a preventable failure, the official account diverted scrutiny from the medical ignorance, political negligence, and societal structures that had truly led to her demise. As a result, the dangers she faced remained unchanged for future queens, whose fates would be shaped by the same patriarchal forces. Jane's genuine suffering was erased and replaced by a sanitized legend that reinforced male authority at the cost of female truth. Edward VI, the infant born through Jane's sacrifice, would turn out to be both Henry VIII's crowning achievement and his most profound disappointment. The much-desired heir lived only 15 years, dying without issue in 1553, and plunging the realm into succession chaos. The queen who had died to secure the future of the Tudor dynasty had, in an ironic twist, unwittingly contributed to its unraveling. Her death gave Henry his son, but not the enduring legacy he had so desperately pursued. Edward's upbringing bore the emotional weight of that maternal loss. From an early age, he was made to understand that his life had come at the cost of his mother's. This knowledge cast a long psychological shadow. Historical records portray Edward as unusually grave and burdened for a child deeply devout, emotionally restrained, and isolated. The moral debt he felt from his mother's death shaped not only his character, but the nature of his short-lived kingship. Henry's relationship with his son was also tainted by Jane's fatal end. Though he publicly celebrated Edward as the pinnacle of his legacy, privately, the child was a constant reminder of the Queen whose death he had facilitated. This created a volatile bond, with Henry alternating between doting attention and cold detachment. The king's emotional inconsistency contributed to Edward's lack of stability and left him ill-equipped for the throne he inherited. Jane's agonizing death also cast a long shadow over her son's physical well-being. Modern interpretations suggest that the complications surrounding his birth may have impacted Edward's health from the outset. Chronic respiratory issues and overall frailty plagued the boy, raising the possibility that the trauma that killed Jane also left him vulnerable, rendering her sacrifice tragically meaningless. She had given her life for a child who would not live long enough to ensure dynastic continuity. The absence of a queen mother during Edward's youth had profound political consequences. Without Jane to guide or defend him, Edward became a pawn in courtly power games. Opportunistic nobles vied for control, treating him not as a monarch, but as a stepping stone to their own ambitions. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, tried to exploit their familial ties, intensifying the factionalism that her presence might have tempered. Moreover, the religious zealotry that marked Edward's reign can be traced in part to the mythology surrounding his mother's death. Protestant reformers framed Jane as a martyr to their cause, using her supposed sanctity to steer the young king toward hardline religious policies. These policies, driven by idealized narratives rather than practical governance, would later fuel sectarian tensions and internal unrest. Protestant leaders instilled in the young Edward the belief that his mother had perished as a martyr for the Protestant cause, burdening him with a deep sense of duty to uphold their religious vision, regardless of the political fallout. Jane's sanctified legacy became a strategic tool, shaping her son's policies in ways that would later unsettle the nation. Her posthumous glorification was not just commemoration, it was manipulation. The financial toll of Jane's brief tenure as queen and the events that followed was staggering. Massive expenditures went into Edward's birth preparations, Jane's ceremonial funeral, the quest for Henry's next wife, and the instability sparked by Edward's premature death. These costs significantly drained the royal treasury. Jane's 17 months on the throne exacted a higher price than many wars, yet left behind no enduring political order or dynastic assurance. On the international stage, the weakness of Edward and Jane's demise exposed the fragility of England's succession. Although Henry had finally sired a male heir, foreign courts quickly realized that the Tudor line was far from secure. Rather than stabilizing England's global standing, Jane's death highlighted the precarious nature of Henry's marital politics. The routine disposal of his wives exposed deep structural flaws in his leadership and cast long shadows over future alliances. Jane Seymour's death marked a grim turning point in Henry VIII's personal and political life. Following her passing, his treatment of women grew more ruthless and transactional. His subsequent unions with Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parware approached with cold efficiency. Spouses became replaceable tools of statecraft, discarded when they ceased to deliver strategic value. Jane's fate had taught Henry that even death could be politically convenient, emboldening him to view queens as expendable assets rather than partners. The deliberate whitewashing of Jane's true ordeal established a dangerous precedent for how royal women's histories would be curated. Future consorts learned that personal survival hinged not on reality, but on their ability to fit pre-approved roles crafted by the crown. Jane's metamorphosis from a discarded casualty of childbirth to a saintly paragon became a prototype for erasing inconvenient truths in favor of state-sponsored myths. Eyewitness testimonies from Jane's final hours, written by her attendants, physicians, and those close to her, were systematically censored or destroyed. Accounts detailing her suffering and fear were edited to align with the court's preferred narrative. In this way, the authentic Jane was buried under layers of revisionist history, leaving the world with a cleansed and politically useful version of her life and death. The medical realities of Jane's tragic end were similarly brushed aside. Tudor doctors, more interested in preserving their status than their patients, failed to address the conditions that had claimed her life. The same hazardous treatments and unsanitary methods persisted for years, threatening other noblewomen with identical fates. Jane's death, rather than prompting reforms in maternal care, was packaged as martyrdom, an image that served political needs at the expense of genuine progress. The emotional toll of Jane's death on her surviving relatives reveals another layer of the tragedy. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, were haunted by remorse for having facilitated her path to Henry's side, even as they sought to capitalize on their royal connection through their nephew Edward. Their eventual executions under Edward's rule can be partially traced back to the psychological strain and political ambition her death unleashed, suggesting her sacrifice cast a long, corrosive shadow over the Seymour lineage. Clerical factions swiftly appropriated Jane's demise to bolster rival theological narratives. Protestant leaders hailed her as a martyr for their reformist cause, while Catholic sympathizers interpreted her suffering as divine retribution for Henry's sins. Yet neither group treated her as a real woman, devastated by forces beyond her agency. Her death was weaponized in England's escalating religious wars, her personal anguish buried beneath ideological strife. Artistic and cultural portrayals of Jane that emerged in the years following her passing only deepened the distortion. From Renaissance-era portraits to Victorian fiction and modern cinema, she has often been romanticized as a serene, self-sacrificing queen, rather than acknowledged as a casualty of institutionalized misogyny. These portrayals helped cement the Tudor court's propagandized version of events, ensuring that Jane's authentic story remains largely obscured from the public consciousness. But Jane's narrative holds relevance far beyond the Tudor chronicles. It underscores broader patterns in how women's histories are recorded and remembered. Her metamorphosis from silenced victim to sanctified martyr exemplifies how dominant powers curate history not to preserve truth, but to reinforce authority. Her life and death become a poignant illustration of how official accounts are engineered to erase painful realities that threaten the status quo. Perhaps the most chilling element of Jane Seymour's legacy is not the fact of her death, but the orchestrated apathy surrounding it. In a court renowned for grand spectacles marking royal events, Jane's mortal suffering was met with deliberate indifference, a choice that exposes the cold mechanics of Tudor governance. The unsettling question that continues to haunt scholars is not whether her life could have been saved. Modern understanding confirms that postpartum infection could have been treated, but whether anyone in Henry's circle truly wished for her survival once she had completed her duty. Emerging evidence implies that Jane's death may have been seen as not only inevitable, but advantageous. Her survival might have disrupted Henry's future marital strategies or challenged his grip on Prince Edward's upbringing. In death, Jane became less of a political liability and more of an ideological asceta-manufactured saint, whose demise could be mythologized to enhance the crown's authority. The timing of Jane's abandonment, coinciding precisely with the confirmation of Edward's health, suggests not medical inevitability, but deliberate calculation. The broader international reaction to her death reveals disturbing patterns of normalized violence against powerful women. Foreign envoys chronicled Jane's decline with dispassionate precision, framing it as a minor diplomatic footnote rather than a human tragedy. Their indifference implies that Jane's disposability was not merely accepted, but expected, reflecting a widespread devaluation of female lives in the political arithmetic of the era. More provocatively, Jane's narrative compels us to consider that the Tudor dynasty's crowning achievement, the birth of a male heir, may have come at the cost of what can only be described as institutionalized murder. The calculated neglect of a queen in distress, the swift orchestration of her successor, and the deliberate rewriting of her end all suggest a chilling premeditation. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who was publicly accused and executed, Jane was quietly allowed to perish once she had fulfilled her use, her death framed not as a failure of care, but as a foregone conclusion. The medical practices that surrounded Jane's final days invite further scrutiny. Tudor healers had access to remedies and techniques that, while crude by modern standards, could have improved her chances. Yet the procedures they employed, bloodletting, purging, and other invasive treatments, appear to have weakened her instead. Whether their actions stemmed from incompetence, fear of royal displeasure, or something more sinister remains a matter of debate. But they undeniably implicate the broader medical community in her fate. Equally troubling is the silence that followed Jane's passing. Her attendants, midwives, and physicians, those who directly observed her decline, offered no public outcry, no defense. Instead, they complied with a system that prioritized succession over survival. Their quiet complicity suggests either an atmosphere of pervasive intimidation or an ingrained acceptance of the notion that women's lives were expendable when set against dynastic objectives. The recasting of Jane's story into a tidy parable of noble sacrifice underscores deeper questions about historical integrity and the crafting of official memory. If the truth of a queen's life could be so thoroughly overwritten by state-sponsored mythology, how many other historical records have suffered the same fate? Jane's erasure exemplifies how history often serves the agenda of the powerful, presenting sterilized accounts that mask the violence upon which they are built. Her case challenges us not only to revisit what we believe about the Tudor court, but to examine how that belief was shaped and whose voices were silenced in the process. The broader implications of Jane Seymour's death continue to resonate in modern debates surrounding reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, and the systemic undervaluation of women's lives in both political and economic frameworks. Her experience offers a historical lens through which to understand how women's reproductive roles have been harnessed for male-centered political goals, and how their deaths in fulfilling these roles are mythologized to shield systems responsible. Though Jane died in 1537, the forces that led to her demise endure. Repackaged in modern institutions and ideologies, Jane's story is not the romanticized fable propagated by Tudor historians, but rather a chilling case study in the cost of unchecked authority and the expendability of those used to sustain it. Her fate reveals the grim logic behind any system that views women primarily as instruments of reproduction, easily cast aside once their purpose is fulfilled. In the royal courts of the 16th century, queens were replaceable vessels. In such an environment, Jane's death was not a tragic exception, but a predictable outcome of dehumanization. The parallels between Jane's experience and the current realities faced by countless women are glaring. In a world where maternal mortality remains high due to underfunded health systems, and where preventable deaths persist because women's well-being is often deprioritized, Jane's legacy feels painfully familiar. Her passing centuries ago highlights patterns of structural neglect and orchestrated indifference that still operate today under different banners, but with similarly devastating effects. The process that led to Jane's forced isolation, reduction to reproductive function, emotional neglect, and eventual transformation into symbolic myth exemplifies how systems of power remove those who become liabilities while preserving their image for propaganda. Her death was executed with disturbing efficiency. It was sanitized, politicized, and ultimately uncontested. This fusion of invisibility and utility rendered Jane's murder an archetype of political violence, hidden in plain sight. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of her legacy is the degree to which her authentic story has been erased. While her name endures in history textbooks, most know her only as the queen who bore Henry's heir, not the woman who died abandoned and exploited. This collective forgetting serves present-day power structures by masking the systemic violence that birthed them. Jane's evolution from human to martyr reveals how history is often weaponized to obscure rather than confront oppression. The impact on education is equally alarming. Generations of learners have been taught about Henry VIII's obsessive quest for a son, without ever confronting its human toll. Jane is routinely portrayed as the obedient consort who succeeded where others failed, instead of a woman sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. This sanitized narrative prevents students from engaging critically with historical power dynamics, gender roles, and the recurrent exploitation embedded in societal norms. Lessons that Jane Seymour's true story, if properly told, powerfully conveys. The psychological impact of Jane Seymour's death transcended her immediate family, shaping broader cultural notions of maternal sacrifice and women's social roles. The myth of her voluntary martyrdom has, for centuries, served as a justification for confining women to reproductive functions and sanctifying their pain as noble devotion to male-dominated agendas. Jane's fabricated sainthood set a precedent. A woman's suffering could be reframed as virtue, setting expectations that real women should likewise endure in silence and obedience. The medical community's failure to learn from her death remains one of history's most glaring lost opportunities to advance maternal health care. Instead of acknowledging the systemic flaws that contributed to her demise, Tudor physicians focused on preserving favor at court, ensuring that the same lethal practices continued to threaten generations of women. Political convenience took precedence over medical responsibility, embedding patterns of negligence that would persist for centuries, exacting a grim toll on women's lives. Religious authorities also manipulated Jane's death, turning her suffering into divine validation of patriarchal norms. Her abandonment was rebranded as providential will, and her agony elevated to holy sacrifice. This reinterpretation provided a religious excuse for the continued devaluation of women, promoting the idea that God sanctioned female submission and suffering. Jane's end was used to justify an ongoing pattern of theological and gendered oppression. Politically, Jane's fate illustrates how inconvenient figures are systematically erased by powerful institutions. Her death offers a chilling example of how state violence can manifest not through overt force, but through calculated neglect. The Queen was discarded once she fulfilled her purpose, and her real story was promptly replaced with a sanitized version that reinforced existing authority while preserving plausible deniability. Jane Seymour died in isolation, surrounded by people but abandoned by all. The king who vowed to protect her had turned away. Her doctors prioritized protocol over care, and the courtiers who once flattered her quickly forgot her. Her death was not a singular misfortune, but an expected outcome within a structure that commodified women for political use. The most terrifying element of her narrative is not its historical distance, but its contemporary reflection. The mechanisms that led to Jane's death, systemic erasure, instrumentalization of the female body, and emotionally indifferent power still operate today under different names and systems, but with the same outcomes. Ultimately, Jane Seymour's legacy lies not in the frail prince she delivered, but in the cautionary tale her life represents. Her story warns of the devastating cost of unchecked authority and the ease with which lives can be consumed and forgotten in pursuit of ambition. Her memory stands as a testament to the hidden sacrifices behind political power, reminding us that every towering achievement may rest upon a silenced voice. Jane Seymour was Henry VIII's third wife, the one who delivered his son. But more importantly, she was a person whose life had value, whose pain was real, and whose story deserves to be remembered not through myth, but through truth.